An empire across 3 continents. The Roman Empire covered a vast stretch of territory that included most of Europe as we know it today and a large part of the Fertile Crescent and North Africa. In this chapter we shall look at the way this empire was organized, the political forces that shaped its destiny, and the social groups into which people were divided. You will see that the empire embraced a wealth of local cultures and languages, that women had a stronger legal position than they do in many countries today, but also that much of the economy was run on slave labor, denying freedom to substantial numbers of persons. From the 5th century on, the empire fell apart in the west but remained intact and exceptionally prosperous in its eastern half. The Caliphate, which you will read about in the next chapter, built on this prosperity and inherited its urban and religious traditions. Roman historians have a rich collection of sources to go on, which we can broadly divide into 3 groups: A. Texts, B. Documents, and C. Material remains. Textual sources include histories of the period written by contemporaries. These were actually called annals because the narrative was constructed on a year-by-year basis. Letters, speeches, sermons, laws, and so on. Documentary sources include mainly inscriptions and papyri. Inscriptions were usually cut on stone, so a large number survive. In both Greek and Latin, the papyrus was a reed-like plant that grew along the banks of the Nile in Egypt and was processed to produce a writing material that was very widely used in everyday life. Thousands of contracts, accounts, letters, and official documents survive on papyrus and have been published by scholars who are assortment of items that mainly archaeologists discovered, for example, through excavation and field survey. For example, buildings, monuments, and other kinds of structures. Pottery, coins, mosaics, even enter landscapes, for example, through the use of aerial photography. Each of these sources can only tell us just so much about the past, and combining them can be a fruitful exercise. But how well this is done depends on the historian's skill. 2 powerful empires ruled over most of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East in the period between the birth of Christ and the early part of the 7th century, say down to the 630s. The 2 empires were those of Rome and Iran. The Romans and Iranians were rivals and fought against each other for much of their history. Their empires lay next to each other, separated only by a narrow strip of land that ran along the river Euphrates. In this chapter we shall be looking at the Roman Empire, but we shall also refer, in passing, to Rome's rival Iran. If you look at the map, you will see that the continents of Europe and Africa are separated by a sea that stretches all the way from Spain in the west to Syria in the east. This sea is called the Mediterranean Sea, and it was the heart of Rome's empire. Rome dominated the Mediterranean and all the regions around that sea in both directions, north as well as south. To the north, the boundaries of the empire were formed by two great rivers, the Rhine and the Danube. To the south, by the huge expanse of desert called the Sahara. This vast stretch of territory was the Roman Empire. Iran controlled the whole area south of the Caspian Sea down to eastern Arabia, and sometimes large parts of Afghanistan as well. These two superpowers had divided up most of the world that the Chinese call Tachin, Greater Qin, roughly the west. The early empire. The Roman Empire can broadly be divided into two phases, early and late, divided by the 3rd century as a sort of historical watershed between them. In other words, the whole period down to the main part of the 3rd century can be called the early empire, and the period after that the late empire. A major difference between the two superpowers and the respective empires was that the Roman Empire was culturally much more diverse than that of Iran. The Parthians, later the Sasanians, the dynasties that ruled Iran in this period, ruled over a population that was largely Iranian. The Roman Empire, by contrast, was a mosaic of territories and cultures that were chiefly bound together by a common system of government. Many languages were spoken in the empire, but for the purposes of administration, Latin and Greek were the most widely used. Indeed, the only languages. The upper classes of the East spoke and wrote in Greek, those of the West in Latin, and the boundary between these broad language areas were somewhere across the middle of the Mediterranean between the African provinces of Tripolitania, which was Latin speaking, and Cyrenaica, Greek speaking. All those who lived in the empire were subjects of a single ruler, the emperor, regardless of where they lived and what language they spoke. The regime established by Augustus, the first emperor in 27 BCE, was called the Principate. Although Augustus was the sole ruler and the only real source of authority, the fiction was kept alive that he was actually only the leading citizen, not the absolute ruler. This was done out of respect for the Senate, the body which had controlled Rome earlier, in the days when it was a republic. The Senate had existed in Rome for centuries and had been and remained a body representing the aristocracy, that is, the wealthiest families of Roman and later Italian descent, mainly landowners. Most of the Roman histories that survive in Greek and Latin were written by people from a senatorial background. From this, it is clear that emperors were judged by how they behaved towards the Senate. The worst emperors were those who were hostile to the senatorial class, behaving with suspicion or brutality and violence. Many senators yearned to go back to the days of the Republic, but most must have realized that this was impossible. Next to the emperor and the Senate, the other key institution of imperial rule was the army. Unlike the army of its rival in the Persian Empire, which was a conscripted army, the Romans had a paid professional army, where soldiers had to put in a minimum of 25 years of service. Indeed, the existence of a paid army was a distinctive feature of the Roman Empire. The army was the largest single organized body in the empire, 600,000 by the 4th century, and it certainly had the power to determine the fate of emperors. The soldiers would constantly agitate for better wages and service conditions. So, what is Republic? The Republic was the name for a regime in which the reality of power lay with the Senate, a body dominated by a small group of wealthy families who formed the nobility. In practice, the Republic represented the government of the nobility, exercised through the body called the Senate. The Republic lasted from 509 BC to 27 BC, when it was overthrown by Octavian, the adopted son and heir of Julius Caesar, who later changed his name to Augustus. Membership of the Senate was for life, and wealth and office holding counted for more than birth. What is a conscripted army? A conscripted army is one which forcibly recruited. Military service is compulsory for certain groups or categories of the population. Okay. These agitations often took the form of mutinies. If the soldiers felt let down by their generals or even the emperor, again our picture of the Roman army depends largely on the way they were portrayed by historians with senatorial sympathies. The Senate hated and feared the army because it was a source of often unpredictable violence, especially in the tense conditions of the 3rd century, when government was forced to tax more heavily to pay its mounting military expenditures. To sum up, the emperor, the aristocracy, and the army were the three main players in the political history of the empire. The success of individual emperors depended on their control of the army, and when the armies were divided, the result usually was civil war. Except for the notorious year 69 CE, when 4 emperors mounted the throne in quick succession. The first 2 centuries were on the whole free from civil war and in this sense relatively stable. Succession to the throne was based as far as possible on family descent, either natural or adoptive. And even the army was strongly wedded to this principle. For example, Tiberius, 14 to 37 CE, the second in the long line of Roman emperors, was not the natural son of Augustus, the ruler who founded the Principate, but Augustus adopted him to ensure a smooth transition. External warfare was also much less common in the first 2 centuries. The empire inherited by Tiberius from Augustus was already so vast that further expansion was felt to be unnecessary. In fact, the Augustan age is remembered for the peace it ushered in after decades of internal strife and centuries of military conquest. The only major campaign of expansion in the early empire was Trajan's fruitless occupation of territory across the Euphrates in the years 113 to 17 CE, abandoned by his successors. What is a civil war? Civil war refers to armed struggles for power within the same country. It contrasts to conflicts between different countries. So here is the box. The Emperor Trajan's dream, a conquest of India. Then, after a writer, 115 to 116, in Antioch market by great earthquake in 116, Trajan marched down the Euphrates to Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, and then to the head of Persian Gulf. There, the historian Cassius Dio describes him looking longingly at a merchant ship setting off for India and wishing that he were as young as Alexander. Fergus Miller, The Roman Near East. Much more characteristic was the gradual extension of Roman direct rule. This was accomplished by absorbing a whole series of dependent kingdoms into Roman provincial territory. The Near East was full of such kingdoms, but by the early 2nd century, those which lay west of the Euphrates towards Roman territory had disappeared, swallowed up by the Rome. Incidentally, some of these kingdoms were exceedingly wealthy. For example, Herod's kingdom yielded the equivalent of 5.4 million denarii per year, equal to 125,000 kg of gold. The denarius was a Roman silver coin containing about 4.5 grams of pure silver. In fact, except for Italy, which was not considered a province in these centuries, all the territories of the empire were organized into provinces and subject to taxation. At its peak in the 2nd century, the Roman Empire stretched from Scotland to the borders of Armenia, and from the Sahara to the Euphrates, and sometimes beyond. Given that there was no government in the modern sense or to help them to run things, you may well ask, how was it possible for the emperor to cope with the control and administration of such a vast and diverse set of territories, with a population of some 60 million in the mid-2nd century? The answer lies in the urbanization of the empire. The great urban centers that lined the shores of the Mediterranean, Carthage, Alexandria, and Antioch, were the biggest among them, were the true bedrock of the imperial system. It was through the cities that government was able to tax the provincial countrysides, which generated much of the wealth of the empire. What this means is that the local upper classes actively collaborated with the Roman state in administering their own territories and raising taxes from them. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of Roman political history is the dramatic shift in power between Italy and the provinces. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it was the provincial upper classes who supplied most of the cadre that governed the provinces and commanded the armies. They came to form a new elite of administrators and military commanders who became much more powerful than the senatorial class because they had the backing of the emperors.